I'll be in 2 Peter again today if you want to join me over there as we talk about this idea of skin in the game again, and we deal with that again today. A quote that I ran across said this: "Loneliness and social isolation can be as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day." Now think about that. That which we didn't even think was that critical, loneliness and social isolation, it's incredibly important. When we talk about this concept of relationships, which is what we're going to talk about today, relationships are so important. It's literally what Jesus wanted us to do. Have a relationship with people. Have a relationship with them to help them understand God's love for them and how He loved them. 40% of Americans say their current relationship is not meaningful. 40% of Americans say the current relationships that they're in are not meaningful. Wow. Wow. I wonder how many relationships we have are not meaningful to us. I wonder how many relationships we're in, they would say of us, we're not meaningful to them. 20% say they feel lonely. You know, you can be surrounded by people and still be lonely. A lot of what's happening in our world today stems from this idea of loneliness or isolation. Whether you feel lonely or isolated, or a group of people might feel lonely and isolated, this is what's happening in our world today, and God's Word has something for us to know about that. U.S. Census reports 25% of the population today live alone. 25%. 1 in 4 live alone. Doesn't mean that they don't go to work. Doesn't mean they don't go to the store. Doesn't mean that they don't have family. But they live alone. I would suggest to you that if we were to consider those who feel alone, how much more that might be. Loneliness may be something that you're dealing with. It's a real problem for a lot of people. We as Christians have to invest in relationships. When we talk about skin in the game, and that's what we're talking about right now, for these couple of weeks, a couple of more after this, we're talking about skin in the game, and which basically means that I'm investing in whatever it is I'm being called to invest in. We started off in the beginning of this chapter talking about God wanting us to invest in our own development spiritually. If I claim Christ as my Savior, which means I've recognized that I have sin that I can't overcome, I can't fix, I can't pay off, and that I trust that what Jesus did on the cross, when He died, when He was buried and rose again, He did all that so that my sin could be covered, erased, done away with, and I could start over. I trust that what He did was for me. When I make those decisions, then the Spirit of God dwells within me, which means now I have a responsibility, and that is to develop, to move forward in this walk, to not just get saved, so to speak, that's the church word, to have my sin guilt erased and just, woo, that's great, but to take steps of growth and development. Well, then he talked about how we need to confirm that calling. We need to make sure of our salvation and make sure of what it is that God has called us to. Today we're going to talk about relationships. And this is important because it is imperative It's imperative. It is critically important that we model relationships that people can find joy and meaning in. Think about that. It is important that we model relationships that people can find joy and meaning in. I mean, I find joy and meaning in my relationship with God. I find joy and meaning in my relationship with you. I can't trust that you do that with me, but I do it with you, and that's all that I can say. But that's the point, isn't it? That we need to be modeling these relationships. Not because we're better. We're just at a different point in our journey. And I'm at a different point because I've walked with God long enough that I've learned how to have joy and meaning in these relationships. But that means I have to invest in the relationship too. We used to be told years ago, marriage is 50-50. That's a lie. It's not 50-50. It's 100-100. I can't put in halfway and expect a full marriage. I got to put all the way in. Yeah, but that's a risk, because what if you invest in that relationship, but they don't invest in the relationship? That's not under your control. Your control is, what are you doing? What are you putting skin in the game? Are you investing in this thing called relationships? Because that's what's important. Are you making every effort? This is a key phrase in this letter. So I ask you to join me in 2 Peter chapter 1. And we're going to look at a few things together today. 2 Peter chapter 1. In this very short letter, Peter uses this phrase, make every effort. And so we start here in verse 12 of 2 Peter chapter 1, and it says, therefore. Now, preachers like to make a funny, and this is what it is. You got to find out what the therefore is there for. I had an English teacher tell me that too. What's it there for? What is it doing? It's concluding something. Peter is making a conclusion. Because of something that was said, now he's saying, because of that, this. And so he's making a conclusion. And here's the conclusion. It's not his first one either. It's his second conclusion. Much like a lot of preachers that I know that'll say, in conclusion, and then they'll talk for 10 minutes. Well, in conclusion, and they'll talk for another 6 minutes. And they'll have 6 in conclusions, and everybody's like, just finish already. I mean, come on. But this is what Peter's saying. He's saying, okay, I'm going to make a concluding statement. What's he basing it on? He's basing it on the verses 5 through 8, where he's saying that we need to be making every effort to add to the faith that we have. We're not saying faith plus is salvation. He said, no, now that you are a believer, now that you have faith, you need to do these things. Look what he's, goodness, knowledge, self-control, endurance, godliness, brotherly affection, and love. And we dove into that a couple of weeks ago. You can go to fbccrowley.org, click on the media. You can find it. Go to our YouTube channel. You'll find it under development. And we dove into some of those things. I'm not going to repeat that. But Peter says, these are some things that you need to be developing in your life. And I love the fact that he begins with faith, but he ends with love. And it's not family love. It's not even brotherly love, because that's listed before. But he's talking about sacrificial kind of love. And Peter's basically saying, look, you have to get to the point that you are in sacrificially loving relationships, which means you may not get anything out of it, but you've got to invest in it. Because that's the calling we have as Christians, is to invest in these relationships that we are supposed to have. But not just the relationships that are easy. We got to invest in relationships that are hard. And let me tell you, we have a lot of difficult relationships in our world today because everybody's mad at somebody. Pick a topic and somebody's mad about it. In fact, I would suggest to you today that you can pick a topic and you can just throw a topic out there to your friend circle and somebody's going to disagree. Don't post it because you will get hazed. I mean, I'm just telling you. You'll get hammered. And it doesn't matter what position you take. But here's the thing. You've got to be true to God and true to yourself. And as you're true to God, somebody won't like it. But we have to model relationships that people find joy and meaning in, which means I have to learn to love beyond myself. I have to learn to love beyond who I am. And so Peter says, because of all of that, I will always remind you. Now, the first lesson that we looked at in this series, it was about you. And basically, we were all taking this understanding that, okay, you do this. And then the next one, okay, you do this. You develop, you consider. But now, Peter's saying, okay, this is my part. Peter is saying, I want you to put skin in the game. I'm going to put skin in the game. I'm going to always remind you of this stuff. Even though you already know it, I'm still going to remind you of this. And what he adds later is, I'm going to remind you till the day I die. I'm going to keep telling you this because it is so critically important. What could be so critically important? For them, it was learning to develop and move forward and come to a position of sacrificial love. What does it mean for us? It means the same thing. There's no magic formula that changes for us. We have to learn to move forward and move beyond what we've known into something else. We have to move beyond religion and get into relationships. We need to get into a relationship more than we need to be in a religion, and that's tough. It's hard. We've been patterned. We've been trained to do it a certain way and to just do religion. But religion isn't the end. I mean, if you want religion, Pharisees had religion, and look what they did. Look what happened to them. They had a sense of religion, but that doesn't mean anything. Because you look at the Old Testament, and they legalized all these things. They legalized a relationship, and they called it a religion. And as they legalized this relationship, they called it a religion, they went downhill after that. They lost the understanding that this was supposed to be a relationship. They were supposed to be in a covenant relationship with God. And that was supposed to change their life. In fact, really, if you read through the Old Testament, they were supposed to love God in such a way that it brought in all of the nations around them. But when they legalized the relationship, instead of keeping it a relationship, when they legalized it all, made it all these other things, and made it this religion, if you will, they stopped loving their neighbor. And they started accosting their neighbor. They started oppressing their neighbor. They started to allow injustices to be in their neighbor. And if you read all the prophets, they're all within a few phrases saying the same thing. You've walked away from God, and you're not doing the right things. You're not honoring love, mercy, and justice. Micah was specific. Look, you know what you're supposed to do. Love, mercy, justice. This is what's supposed to happen. But you're not doing it. Why? Because you think that as long as you live up to the bare minimum of the religious law that you're going to be fine. And that's not what's happening. So Peter's like, I'm going to always remind you of these things, even though you know them and they're established in the truth you now have. I think it's right, as long as I'm in this bodily tent, to wake you up with a reminder. Okay, think about that. He's basically saying, look, I'm going to continue to give you wake-up calls until you wake up. I'm going to continue to do that until you get out of your spiritual bed and get into your spiritual life and get about the business of the day that you're supposed to be about. But as long as you want to do nothing but lay around in the bed, I'm going to give you a wake-up call. And so here it is. Here it is. We have to learn, as a Christian community, we have to learn how to sacrificially love. What does that mean? Well, Revelation says that every nation, tribe, tongue, and people will be represented as they stand before God. And here's what I think. Every nation, tribe, tongue, and people should be represented in every church on this earth too. And if there are churches where that's not true, they're not living right. They're not doing right. They're not doing what they're called to do, because we are called to love every person. See, this is what happens when we ask, who should I love, or who's my neighbor? And Jesus was asked that question. Well, who is my neighbor? And here's the thing. Here's the thing about that. The guy that was asking wanted a way out. He wanted a way out. He wanted to be told, hey, as long as you love Joe next door that you lived next door to for 30 years, man, you're good. And he was going to walk away feeling good. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, sure, yeah, you're supposed to do that, but it's more. There's more to it than that. In fact, he said, you need to love that person that you don't like very well. You need to love that person you disagree with on a lot of things. You need to love that person. You need to love every person, really. Who's your neighbor? Everybody's your neighbor. And this is where it gets tough. Because the sinful nature is so easily dragging us back. And this is what he says, hey, yeah, love your neighbor. That's awesome. Just make sure it's only those in proximity to you. And see, immediately this is what our mind says. Our mind says, yeah, I need to love the people on my block. Here's what the sinful nature tells us. Love the people that look just like you. Only. That's what the sinful nature will say. Hey, as long as they look like you, smell like you, act like you, and do the things you do, love them. And Jesus would tell this person that was asking, hoping for that response, he would say, no, that's not how that's supposed to work. In fact, you're supposed to hate that person, is what that guy wanted. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, no, love them. Jesus would also say in the Sermon on the Mount, you're not supposed to just, pray for them. Pray for your enemies. He would say, if you get struck, go the extra mile with them. Turn the other cheek. And these are all things that we have to learn in a moment in history where everybody seems to be angry. Everybody seems to be upset. Peter's saying, look, I'm going to put skin in the game, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to invest in these relationships. Why? Because Peter can remember. Peter remembers back what Jesus did for him. When Peter denied Jesus 3 times in one evening, and Jesus died and he went to the grave, and Peter lived with that for a while, and he had to deal with that. But Jesus sought him out on the beach and said, we need to have a talk. Let's talk. And through that process, Peter, that guilt had been removed, and Jesus removed the obstacles and removed the walls and removed the problems that were a barrier between he and Peter. And he helped him overcome those hurdles. But Peter, being stubborn and semi-hard-headed, didn't quite learn it all, because Paul had to call him on the carpet when he came back to Jerusalem one time and say, look, why do you act one way in front of this group, but you act a different way in front of this group? Why is that, Peter? And here's the thing. Paul didn't just say that in a back office, back room somewhere. He stood up in the middle of church and said, hey, Peter, got a question for you. How come when the Jews come in town, you act differently than when nobody else is here? I mean, he was getting called out in front of everybody. So Peter's like, I'm just passing it down. I got a wake-up call, and I realized the importance of that wake-up call is what Peter's saying. He says, look, you've got to learn how to move beyond. And writing in a time and a place where there was a lot of hatred. I mean, they had political hatred, they had prejudicial hatred, they had racial hatred, they had religious hatred. Oh, wait, it sounds like today. So what Peter said to them then rings true for us today. As long as our churches do not reflect our communities, I believe we have sin in the camp. Until our churches reflect the community in which we live in, our work is not finished. As long as you have a community that is widely diverse and you have a church that is not, there's a problem. And my friends, we cannot, as Christians, continue to say the problem is out there. No, the Bible clearly states we are to be developing into sacrificial love. In other words, setting aside what I want for the good of somebody else. That if I'm learning to love my neighbor, and I'm going to invest and put skin in this game, it means I'm not going to be concerned about what I want. I'm going to be concerned about what they want. I'm not going to be concerned about what I feel. I'm going to be concerned about how do they feel. And maybe we need to stop talking about it and simply start listening to it. These are hard words. This is a tough moment. I heard it put this way. That if I stepped out on my porch and my neighbor's house was on fire, what would I do? I'd probably call 911. I'd probably go over and say, hey, what's going on? And I'd holler and I'd scream, hey, who's in there? Who's in the danger zone? Who's in there? Hey, is anybody else left? What can we do? And I'd try to get my hose to go all the way over to my neighbor's house. I just got to put the fire out. Wouldn't it be silly if my neighbor's house over here was on fire, but I tried to water something over on this side? And as long as I put my head in the sand and say the wrong is everybody else, then I'm in a position of sin too. We all bear responsibility for where we are. And we all bear responsibility to where we're going to be. And as Christians, we are called to love our neighbor. I mean, Jesus said when he was asked, hey, what's the greatest commandment? Again, a trap. Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And the second's like to it. Remember what it said? Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who's my neighbor? So who's your neighbor? It's not just the person that lives directly next to you. Your neighbor is your community folk. What are you investing into this thing we call Christianity? What are you putting in? Because you know what? We receive a lot of benefits. What are we putting in? Because I'm telling you, we've got a whole community watching us. What are you going to do in this moment? Will we continue to put our heads in the sand and say, hey, there's no problem. We don't have a problem. We are not the problem. And that's the problem. Ignorance is no defense. We, as a Christian community, need to understand that if we say the Bible is true, and we do, then you just have to quickly go over to Galatians 3:23 where it says there's no male, there's no female, there's no slave, there's no free, there's no Jew, there's no Gentile. There is just humanity. There's humanity. And there's no difference when you come to the cross. There's no difference. The ground is completely level at the cross. And as far as I can tell, from God's perspective, there's not a white cross and a black cross and a brown cross and a yellow cross. There's not a white zone, black zone, brown zone, yellow zone. There's just the cross. And at the cross where Jesus died, we all find our freedom. At the cross is where he died so that all humanity could find freedom. And as we walk away from the cross and we segregate ourselves into all of these things, the heart of God breaks because Revelation says that's not happening when we get to stand before him. Why does it happen when we worship him today? We must address the prejudices, the angers, the hates, the divisions that reside in the deep crevices of our heart and our attitude and our mind. Because on the outside, we're going to be whitewashed tombs. On the outside, we're going to say, oh, hey, I love everybody. But on the inside, you start complaining, and you're frustrated, and you're angry, and you make these offhand comments in your head, and sometimes you make them out loud, and unforgivably, we post them on the internet. How is that being Christ-like? How? I wish somebody could explain to me and justify that kind of behavior, because I see no justification for it. Loving people, loving your neighbor, has no divisions. Jesus made no extra remarks. Do you have skin in this game? Because it's time that we stop mimicking a religion from the 60s and we start living with love this century. And stop treating people like we were taught to growing up, and start treating people the way God does. He sees righteousness and unrighteousness. And until we as the Christian community stop referring to people with an adjectival moment in front of it, we have not moved forward. God does not see the color of skin, but the devil wants you to. God says he gave Jesus for all the world. Let's stop thinking that he gave it for one portion so that we can somehow lord it over another one.